Good morning, and thank you for being here. It's a beautiful Tuesday morning in Lansing. Gorgeous day. Legislature is going to be in session, so hopefully we will see lots of your legislators during the day today and then at our reception tonight. Looking forward to that. So I am going to cover a few topic areas, but before I do, I want to remind you that in your welcome bags, we put together several policy briefs that go into a little bit more detail on some of the issues. So I'm not going to cover all of those issues here today, but please take a look at those. We have some on the child care fund, some trial court funding. We have polluter pay, I believe. Yes, I made my list. We made a whole host of them. The Medicaid waiver program that we were looking toward getting done this year. Unfunded mandates is in there. And then on your table is a revenue sharing trust fund policy brief. I am going to cover that in quite a bit of detail to this morning. But yes, we'll talk about sort of what's happening in Lansing, what those legislative dynamics look like, and how it's now finally changing a little bit. We will cover some of what the budget process looks like at this point in time, and then go over a couple of policy issues that are front and center in Lansing right now. So first of all, I think we've been struggling in Lansing dealing with the split in the House. So the House in November had 2 of their members elected to mayoral positions, and that created a vacancy. So there's no clear majority in the House. The House was split 54 Republicans, 54 Democrats. And what that means is the Democrats still maintain control of the committees, still maintain control of the floor and the agenda, but it really required, bipartisan support to get any kind of legislation passed through the chamber, because you just didn't have enough votes in your own party. And that created sort of what I call a very significant slowdown in the movement of policy. And I think, Sam Gibson, we'll talk in a few minutes, really struggled with that when she was working on our trial court funding issue. But since that 54-54 split was there until just this past April, I think it was the 16th, there was a special election to fill those 2 vacant seats. Those vacant seats were won by Democrats, so the Democrats will now have a 56-54 majority in the House. The elections, I believe, were certified just this week, and they should be seated at any moment, correct? Yes, looking over at Representative Vanderwall. So now that dynamic will change just a little bit. Democrats will still be in control, and the House will be at full strength. So we expect some more movement of legislation at that time. One of the other items, though, that we don't talk much about is immediate effect. And Sam wrote about it a little bit in our legislative updates. We talked about it in our podcast, which I hope you are all listening to our podcast that we try to put out every week. But immediate effect is what we give the bill, what the House or the Senate will give the bill if they want the bill to have immediate effect and not have to wait until 90 days after the last day of that legislative session. In the House, it's typically gavelled on. They just assume that everybody supports immediate effect and they gavel it on. It's in their House rules. In the Senate, on the other hand, they have to have a 2/3 vote, and they have to vote for immediate effect. And so that has also created a dynamic where the Senate Republicans, who are in the minority, have a much larger voice in the effectiveness of the legislation that's getting passed by that chamber. And so we struggle with that a little bit too on the trial court funding, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So let's talk about the budget. Every year in February, the governor gets up and recommends what she wants the state budget to look like, from state departments to our own line items, from revenue sharing to grants that we get through different departments, the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission monies. She makes a recommendation based on her priorities and what she wants. Then those bills go to the House and the Senate. Each chamber respectively works on those budget bills and makes their recommendations. They pass those recommendations out of each respective chamber over to the other. They do the same thing with the budgets again, and then they sit for a few minutes, few days, few weeks, depends on when they get them done. They wait for what we call the revenue estimating conference. That revenue estimating conference is when the fiscal agencies get together, the legislative leaders get together, they talk about what they believe the revenue is going to look like for the next coming fiscal year. And they narrow that down. We anticipate that being May 17th of this year, and so they'll have a better idea of what the fiscal forecast is. Once that happens, leadership gets into a room and they go to each of the subcommittee chairs on the budgets and say, this is what your target is. This is the number you have to meet in your budget. This is all you have to spend. You've already set your priorities. This is where it is. Now get together with the other chamber and figure out what that budget is going to look like. Many of those items are decided by the subcommittee chairs on those budgets. Many of those items are also determined by the Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, the State Budget Office. Some of those things elevate all the way up to that. But that's what happened in conference committee. At this stage of the budget process, we are only at passing out of the first chamber. So we have a long way to go. But I set that up because we have a situation with our revenue sharing that is very different. The governor had one recommendation, the House another, and then the Senate a third. And all of them are okay. Some are absolutely better for counties than others. And so I want to take just a few minutes to talk about that. The governor has recommended, hold on, I'm going to skip real quick. Nope. Okay. I thought we had a chart. On the table, you will see the governor's recommendation for our revenue sharing. On that sheet, it is a 5% increase in what your revenue sharing was last year. Plus, if you have allocated all of your ARPA funds, you would get an additional 3%. She also recommended 2% for public safety, which she's done in the past couple of years, where they say we want a certain portion of your revenue sharing dollars to go directly to public safety efforts. That's where the legislation started. Now, the revenue sharing recommendation out of the House subcommittee is exactly what we've been asking for with our revenue sharing trust fund bills. Those revenue sharing trust fund bills say we want to carve out 8% of the first 4% of the state sales tax, put that into a fund, and then pay our revenue sharing payments out of that. And that's exactly what the House did. We couldn't have asked for better. Until we get to the Senate, wait till you see that one. So they did that. They also added in 1.5% of the state sales tax for public safety. This is that public safety and violence prevention fund effort that was worked on by Representative Farhat and passed over to the Senate last November. That public safety monies is really geared toward those communities that have a large violent crime rate, and not for every community across the state. The only way that your county sheriff's department is going to see any of that public safety trust fund dollars is if they have a contract with a community that has a large amount of violence in their area, and then that exchange of funds can flow through that smaller township or city to the sheriff's department. I don't anticipate that to really benefit us, benefit your sheriff's departments much, or your jails, or your prosecutor's office, but it's there. One other item in the House budget recommendation, I keep kicking these, sorry, is $3 million to go to your prosecutors to help with some of that backlog and the problem that they're having with enough staff. So overall increase in the House budget for county revenue sharing, $11.8 million. Then the Senate made their recommendations just a couple of days later. And in the Senate recommendations, that is very much like our revenue sharing trust fund that we've been asking for, but they did it a little differently. They did not include the public safety trust fund dollars. What they did was take 9.1% of the state sales tax and dedicate that to 9.1% of the first 4%, gotta remember to say that, dedicate that to county revenue sharing and statutory revenue sharing, so city, village, and township too. But they changed the methodology for distribution. So the Senate recommendation says whatever you are getting in fiscal year 24, you will get. That's your base amount. And then this additional $52.5 million would be distributed out on top of that base amount to counties in a way that is an inverse relationship to your taxable value in your county. Now, I can get really geeky and talk about this, or you can read the policy brief, but what this means is, back when we did our reserve fund, when we went off of revenue sharing and you paid yourself your own revenue sharing payments out of a property tax shift, that created significant winners and losers in the amount of your current revenue sharing payment. And so Senator Cherry went through and looked at, how do we right-size this a little bit? And his way of doing that was creating a distribution formula for just that increased amount that is based on that inverse relationship. Other really good highlights in these, both the House and the Senate proposal, they eliminate the one-time funding, which is not something that you can budget for year to year, right? You want to know what you're going to get and what those increases are going to be, and not just necessarily the one-time. It eliminated the county incentive program, which is additional amount of paperwork, which I'm sure all the administrators in the in the audience understand how difficult that was, and just rolls that all up into one. The other thing that I want to mention about the Senate budget proposal is, again, on prosecutors. He took almost $35 million and said, we are going to send out money to the 15 counties with the most crime. And we are going to dedicate that per capita, that $35 million, to help with those prosecutors' struggles with staffing and retaining and all of those things. So not to every county across the state, although he hopes to eventually add funds to that prosecutor line item to help every county across the state. And I just covered all of that. Sorry, talked ahead of myself. All right, a couple other things on the budget. Want to talk a little bit about road funding. Now, I just want to talk about a pilot program that they're doing. The Senate put in boilerplate language that said we want to do a study on what a miles-based user fee would look like. The House put in language that says we want a pilot program with an advisory committee, and we want to figure out what this is going to look like and how it would work to switch from a gas tax to a miles-based user fee. This is a long time coming. I don't want you to panic, okay? But we are about $4 billion a year below what we need to fund and fix our roads across the state. And I hear from all of you now that it's just a disaster. And how do we fix it? We've got more electric cars coming online, more fuel-efficient vehicles coming online, and the revenue just isn't going to be there from the current gas tax. Several states across the country have already adopted a miles-based user fee type of model. Many others are looking at it. So Michigan is getting on board, and we're going to start with a pilot program to see what that looks like. And it's going to be up to this, up to this advisory committee to determine how many people are participating, what that looks like. Is it just those who drive electric vehicles and they start that way? It's going to be a while, though. We anticipate probably the beginning of 2026 before even that pilot program gets on board. But I just want to keep mentioning it again, and I know we're going to have a breakout session on what, different kind of road funding options are and what this mileage-based user fee would look like. Trial court funding. All right. You've heard about this over and over and over again. Counties have the ability to collect fees from criminal defendants to help fund our trial courts. And according to estimates, it's about $1 million a week across $1 million a week across the state. And we were running up to a deadline because we had our sunset deadline was May 1st. So you can only collect those fees until May 1st unless this legislation got done. And we tried for months and months and months through the House and the Senate with those political dynamics to get this legislation across the finish line and to the governor's desk before May 1st. Because otherwise that creates a deficit in every one of your court budgets. So after much work, many phone calls, many advocacy campaigns, many of you reaching out to your legislators, it did finally get across the finish line. It is now sitting on the governor's desk awaiting her signature to extend that sunset. Part of the hiccup in getting that done on time was another piece of legislation that really seeks to gather data to implement the Trial Court Funding Commission's recommendations. Again, that is a policy brief in your packet. I encourage you to take a look at it, but House Bill 5334 is still awaiting movement on the House floor. It did not garner enough votes to go to the governor's desk at the same time the sunset extension did, but now that those two House members are seated, we anticipate that happening. I will say it was a ton of effort, on our whole team's part, but really Samantha Gibson in our office did a great job. So I want you to just take a look at what Sam had to say in committee. Do I have to press play again, Derek?
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Chang and
Okay.
committee members. My name is Sam Gibson, and I'm a Government Affairs Associate at the Michigan Association of Counties. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today in support of Senate Bills 814 and 815. MAC, again, is supportive of both of these bills, and our first priority is the passage of Senate Bill 815, Senator Schink's bill, which would extend the sunset on fee authority for courts to December 31 of 2026. If we go beyond May 1 without the passage of Senate Bill 815, courts will lose a significant portion of their operational funding that they're able to collect with the statutory authority that we have now. MAC has been supportive of all 5 of the Trial Court Funding Commission recommendations that Judge Boyd just went over. And Senate Bill 814, sponsored by Senator Chang, moves us in the direction of eventually implementing those recommendations to better and more efficiently fund our courts. Counties are by far the largest funding source for Michigan's trial courts. There are 4 sources of funding to trial courts. 44% from local funding units, 26% are court-generated revenues, 23% of funding comes from the state, and of that 23%, a considerable portion is made up of court costs from local courts. So the assessments are collected locally and remitted to the state. On average, it's $127 million annually that courts and local funding units remit to the state. So when you consider that $127 million and remove that from the state's share of court funding, the state share is greatly reduced. And then lastly, 7% of court funding comes from the federal government. So it's clear that counties are the largest funding source for trial courts. Without the court's ability to impose fines and fees and the subsequent loss of operational funding, the responsibility to backfill that funding will fall on the county. Counties are already funding their trial courts. Jackson County, for example, contributes over $3.1 million of general fund dollars annually to their district and circuit court due to budget shortfalls, and this number continues to grow. So with the contributions that counties already make, the loss of the court's ability to collect these fees will pose a substantial cost burden to counties and a funding gap that they cannot make up for, upwards of $50 million annually statewide for every court. Again, MAC is supportive of both Senate Bills 814 and 815, with our first priority to extend the sunset. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so yes, very successful. The Senate had done an introduction of those bills, so that's why you heard Senate bill numbers in there. But the House bill to extend the sunset, sponsored by Sarah Leitner, did actually make it to the governor's desk, so we're just awaiting signature. We'll recap something that happened last year, and I know this is near and dear to everyone, almost everyone in this room, and that had to do with the renewable energy siting legislation that went through last year. It's now Public Act 233 of 2023. The House and the Senate were successful in getting this legislation passed and sent to the governor prior to losing their 2 members in November in that November election. So this went to the governor. It was very contentious and very partisan legislation that went through. MAC remained opposed to the solar and large-scale solar and wind siting legislation. That is those, large facilities for wind and solar that now can be sited by the Public Service Commission and not the local unit of government. unless you have what they call a compatible renewable energy ordinance. Still lots of questions about what this law means. The Michigan Public Service Commission is in the process of creating rules on it. But there's also an initiative out there, Citizens for Local Choice, that is seeking to repeal a portion of this law, the portion of this law that gives the citing authority to the Michigan Public Service Commission and taking it away from the locals. It does not change the renewable energy goals. The petition drive does not. It does not change any of that. All of that would still remain the same. It's just seeking to take the Michigan Public Service Commission citing authority in your local unit portion out of the legislation. If you have more questions on that, though, Madeline Feta in our office worked very hard on that. You can ask her questions. Just another plug for the Revenue Sharing Trust Fund. Now, I told you what was in the budget bills, but there are also policy bills out there that need to be passed and sent to the governor and signed into law so that we can make this our revenue sharing portion of the state sales tax every year going forward. And we will talk with Representative O'Neill, who I know is here somewhere in just a minute, yes, about those trust fund bills. But they did pass the House by a huge majority, totally bipartisan, 106-5. And they are now sitting in the Senate Committee on Finance and have not moved, but we are hoping that through this budget process and with the trust fund being recommended in both the House and Senate budgets that we can get it across the finish line. And last but not least, they've been talking quite a bit about short-term rentals in Lansing this week, or the past couple of weeks. We testified to this 10-bill package last week, when we were talking to the legislators about, counties really are there to provide law enforcement in many, many, many of our local communities out there. We also, over 20 counties do some sort of zoning and are going to be responsible for enforcing zoning ordinances when it comes to short-term rentals. But this is a 10-bill package put together primarily by Representative Joey Andrews, and it creates a system where you would have to register your short-term rental with the state of Michigan. You would have to make sure you met certain criteria, certain safety criteria, where you would have to have a smoke alarm, you would have to have a carbon monoxide detector, a fire extinguisher, and someone within 30 miles to respond in case you have an emergency. These are, thoughtful pieces. It would ban local units of government. It would prohibit local units of government from banning short-term rentals within their jurisdiction, but they could zone for them in different areas. They could limit how many there were. But this 6% excise tax that was added on there for a short-term rental would be payable to the local unit of government where that Airbnb or VRBO was located. Unfortunately, when the legislation was drafted, counties were not included. This was, sort of between the Municipal League and the Townships Association. And it failed to recognize the huge role that counties play in regulating and policing these types of enterprises. So we are seeking some amendments. There were 2 weeks of hearings. I'm not sure, the bills are nowhere near ready to be voted out. So don't hold your breath. I don't think that they're going to get done quite yet, but still a lot of work to do on those.